Hello. I had a question I wanted to ask of you that's coming from a recent experience with my daughter. She's started Sunday school, and she asked me, Daddy, who's God's daddy and mommy? And I literally I couldn't answer. I said, that's a really good question. I don't know how to answer that. Maybe you can help me answer this for a 6-year-old.
Not without perpetuating something that we think you'd all be better off without. And by that we mean, have you read the Bible lately?
No.
Well, that's just as well. Because if you do, you'll be full of questions. Like, well, maybe it's just as well we don't go there either. It's interesting, isn't it, how even a 6-year-old starts with where she stands and then tries to explain it. So she can see how she came from mommy and daddy, and you can trace your line back a little ways, but when you get back to Adam and Eve, then what? And who were all those wives that all those babies were born from, if that story is accurate? Was Eve the mother of Cain and Abel? And was she also their wife? Did their children come from that relationship? Were there other women around? No, she was the only one. Well, that's weird. That's weird. Explain that to your 6-year-old. In other words, when you start with false premises, and you just have to make the fairy tale richer and richer and richer, you say. So we would, once someone asks, that means they want to know. So we would say, well, honey, we're speaking from your perspective. I guess before we can really answer that question, we have to figure out what God is. In other words, do you think God is a little girl? Do you think God is like a grandfather? Or is God a energy stream, a source energy? And she won't know where to go with that at all. And then you could say, I think that we'll all have to think about this a little more and figure out, say to her, this I feel sure of. I feel sure that you and mommy and me and the others that we see are extensions of this wonderful energy and love that many are calling God. And I think that we are all the leading edge, the furthest most expansion, the very best part of that which is God. And in the same way that I don't look back often to the day you were born or the days before you were born as much as I look at where you are now. I think that the best part of understanding who you are is to look from where you are to where you are going, not look back to where you were the day you were born. Because I have to tell you, honey, on that day, you weren't much fun. We weren't having conversation about anything. You seemed completely oblivious to what was going on around you. I couldn't even really get you to focus on me. I waved a lot of rattles and things, but you had other things on your mind. It's so much more satisfying to interact with you now. And I know that every day that goes by, you're going to become more as am I. And I think that's where my best understanding of you is in looking at who you are and where you're going, not at where you've been. And I feel the same way about God. Looking to the expansion of that which is God, because I don't think any of us can go back to the beginning of anything. Now, that's a big answer for a little question. And so maybe you want to just say, I don't know, we'll figure it out later. And it's always better to go general and stay in the vortex than it is to get specific and get all worried about things. And a lot of times it's just a frivolous little thought that's moving through her mind. Mostly it's her inner being inspiring her to ask a question of you that you want to think about. In other words, she couldn't care less, really. She's really not looking for any deep answer. She just knows that what she's hearing over there doesn't hold water to what she's knowing in her heart. That's really what that question was saying to you. Her question, what she's really saying, and if she had more words she'd say it, is, I'm hearing stuff that isn't adding up, and I can't figure out why, but I can feel some stuff that's really off here. It's just really off. And can you clarify it for me and make it more on? That's really what is at the basis of her question. And we're not saying that she shouldn't be at church. We're not saying that there's not a wonderful thing that's going on there. We're not trying to guide anybody toward or away from anything. We just want you to realize that she's reaching for some alignment and hoping to get it from you. And as you stand in a place of alignment yourself, in other words, do you feel that you know what God is?
I've given up the traditional view of it a long time ago. The question that's behind the question that she asked next was, how did all this start? It's kind of reaching for, how did this world get created? How did God create the world? And of course, they're talking about it, the Bible's version. That's Sunday school. But
well, you could enhance that for her by saying, I believe that all things start with an idea. And I think that God, using her point of view, her perspective, was just really good at envisioning. I think he envisioned this beautiful planet and this beautiful earth, and I think he saw us all as living happily ever after. I think he saw it as just a wonderful environment for us to express and expand. And I think that in every moment that we feel wonderful, that we're not just experiencing our personal expansion, we're experiencing the expansion of God. And I can just feel that pleasure in the expansion. And in other words, just get in the vortex and then answer her question. Get in the vortex and then answer her question. It can't go wrong, you see. It can't go wrong.
So, that brings
too many people have tried to answer that question from outside the vortex, and that's why religion is so screwy. That's why anybody, and nearly all have done it. That's why you can take an energy that is pure positive energy, liquid love, and turn it into a vengeful God. It takes some serious time outside the vortex to do that.
And that's my God, is a God of love. And it's not a bearded guy in a cloud like you've described earlier. That's not my view at all.
Then tell that to your 6-year-old.
Yeah, I will. I should. And I guess the question for me,
you could say, I think the mommies and the daddies that we're all looking for are part of this physical experience more than they are part of the non-physical experience. And I think that which is God is creating through thought.
Well, and I think the conversation is she's an extension of God.
Of course she is.
I mean, she is God. We're all God in terms of, and I don't have the eloquence that you have to describe that, but we're components. We are chips off the block. But the question
You
that's
see,
kind of stirring
the
within me.
the reason that we're having this conversation is because you're not so much really driven by wanting to answer her specific question, because you have all kinds of understanding about God that you know that she's not really ready to conceptualize or really grasp. But what's percolating in you that is beginning to surface, and that what the answers that you're really looking for is, how am I going to square what I am beginning to know and understand with what's being taught to her? In other words, how am I going to square that? In other words, do I keep that fairy tale alive? Do I keep that fairy tale alive, or do I express to her as I know to be, or can I do both?
And that's definitely what I'm struggling with. And, it brings up the question I have about
here's the answer. Here's the answer.
Who is Jesus? That's the next question I'm preparing for.
Well, this will help you a great deal. You can go to church from outside the vortex. That's when you feel guilty and sinful. Or you can go to church from inside the vortex. That's when you feel whole and in alignment. You can look at others in your world from outside the vortex. That's when you say, you're in the wrong church, you're in the wrong church, you're in the wrong church. If you want to be saved, you got to come to my church. Or you can look at the other people in other religions from inside the vortex, where you say, diversity is a wonderful thing, and all of us are extensions of source energy, and all of us are worthy and blessed. In other words, you can approach everything that comes up. All you got to do is just make sure that you're in the vortex, and then. So if you don't know, if an answer doesn't come easily to you, you're not in the vortex. And if you're in the vortex, an answer will come easily, and it will be the right answer. Now think about what that means. The right answer meaning, I want to make my little 6-year-old as weird as I am and send her to Sunday school. In other words, she goes to Sunday school knowing what I know. They'll get her. They'll tell her she's wrong. In other words, I don't want her to talk like I am at Sunday school. So what are you putting in the vortex? You put into the vortex, you want her to have a solid footing. You want her to have resonance with source. You want her to feel such a full connection to that which is source, that she always feels stable and loved and worthy. You want her to have friendships with other people. You want her to get along. You want to be able to give her words that make her mesh with the real world. In other words, what you want is for her to be in the vortex, tuned into source energy, and at Sunday school, you see. And we think that what's bothering you is, because it happened to you, it happened to almost everybody. Most everybody who goes to Sunday school gets kicked out of the vortex. The vortex can't hold you while you're feeling guilty, while you're casting blame, in other words, there's just a lot of stuff that is out of the vortex stuff. So we would start like that right away. We would say, we would demonstrate our love of God and our love of alignment from inside the vortex. And you will discover that the perfect words will be there for you all along the way. And even more, you'll discover that this little child is delivering to you questions from inside the vortex in an attempt to extract answers to you, through you to her, but through you to you from inside the vortex. In other words, she didn't ask that question because she has a sincere question about it. She asked that question because she's channeling God so that you'll know. Jesus said, the little ones will lead you, you see. And nothing could be more accurate. These little ones haven't forgotten who they are. They're still mostly in the vortex, you see. They're mostly still in the vortex.